Hello there, and thanks for tuning in to this bite-sized talk. My name's Murray Andrews, and I'm a numismatist. That's a coin specialist to you and me. Since late 2020, I've been working on a project with Museums Worcestershire that aims to unlock some of the hidden histories that lie behind some of the objects in the museum's numismatic collections. Now, these collections include about 3,000 coins, tokens, medals and banknotes, everything from ancient Greece and Rome right up to the modern day, so there are plenty of stories to tell. But in this talk, I want to zoom in on a couple of objects that cast light on a very important story, and that's the rise and fall of slavery in the British Atlantic, from the 17th through to the 19th centuries. To start us off, I want to introduce you to this object, a Barbados penny token, issued in 1788. It's made of copper alloy and measures about 3 centimetres across, so it's a little bit bigger than a modern 50p piece and a little bit thicker too. The obverse or head side, which you can see here, depicts an African wearing a plumed crown. The reverse or tail side, meanwhile, has a picture of a pineapple and the text Barbados penny 1788. The token has suffered from some wear and tear over the years, about what you'd expect of a circulating currency, but if you squint your eyes you can just about make out 2 words below the head: I serve. This token brings us face to face with the image of an enslaved African, a central figure in the history of the British Atlantic. Between 1640 and 1807, some 3.1 million African slaves were packed into British ships and transported to colonies in the Americas, part of a transatlantic triangular trade that brought great profits to the slavers and great misery to their victims. Those that survived the perilous journey across the Atlantic Middle Passage, where disease, malnutrition and abuse were rife, soon found themselves sold as property to colonial plantation owners, forced into a life of hard labour for long days under the hot sun, with the threat of the whip and the branding iron never far from the distance. In fact, it was a plantation owner who commissioned this token, Sir Philip Gibbs, owner of the Springhead plantation in western Barbados. Gibbs had around 170 slaves working the sugarcane fields at Springhead when this token was made, and it was through their labour that he was able to build a small fortune exporting sugar back to Britain. He was far from alone in making his money in this manner, and in fact we know of several individuals from Worcestershire who also owned slaves and plantations in the Caribbean at this time. One of them, Nicholas Lechmere, was born in St John's in 1755. He owned the Mount Atlas coffee plantation in central Jamaica, where 159 slaves lived and worked just before his death in 1817. Another, William Hall of Beverley, held sugar and rum plantations in Jamaica, including one near Montego Bay, known as the Worcester Plantation. For planters like these, slaves meant money, a relationship that's materialised in Gibbs's token coinage. Gibbs's Barbados token gives a powerful illustration of the importance of slavery in the British Atlantic. This next object, however, helps us to explore the relationships between plantation slavery and English society. So this is a halfpenny token. It's made of copper alloy and is about half the size of the previous object, somewhere between a modern 1p and a 2p piece, but a lot thinner. It's one of many tokens that were made in England between 1648 and 1672, when private traders decided to meet the need for small change by issuing token coins of their own. This particular token was made in London in 1662 on behalf of a Worcester trader, William Swift. On the obverse, on the left-hand side, you can see his name, the value and the date, and on the reverse, on the right-hand side, you can see the slogan, the City of Worcester, and the city arms, the 3 black pears. William Swift was one of 17th century Worcester's most prominent businessmen. He worked variously as a draper, a grocer, and crucially, a sugar baker. Sugar was one of his main sources of income, and we can reconstruct aspects of the business using historic documents. William seems to have purchased raw sugar at Bristol, where it had been imported from Caribbean slave colonies like Barbados and Jamaica. The sugar was then shipped up the River Severn and offloaded at Worcester, where it would be carted across the city to his sugar house. Now this was a factory situated beside his residence on Foregate Street, where the raw sugar would be boiled and refined for domestic consumption. Once the processing was complete, his sugar would be sent over to his warehouse on Powick Lane, a lost street just north of Huntington Hall, and would then be sold on in the retail and wholesale trades. Now, while there is no evidence that William was a slave trader or a slave owner, his lucrative business was fundamentally entangled with the system of Atlantic slavery. The very stuff that he processed and sold at Worcester was the product of slave labour on the Caribbean plantations. And he was not alone in this. The consumption of goods originating in the New World plantations was pervasive in the 17th and 18th centuries, and during this period, many Worcestershire businesses were readily dealing in coffee, chocolate, mahogany, sugar, tobacco, and similar products. William's sugar business, however, gives an important example of how metropolitan links to slavery could intensify over generations. After William's death in 1688, the sugar refinery eventually passed to his son, Samuel Swift. Samuel was a keen businessman, and he also held a number of important civic posts. For example, he was Mayor of Worcester and the city MP. In 1714, Samuel's commercial interest expanded after he acquired a slave plantation in Clarendon on the south side of Jamaica, which he still held at the time of his death. His will refers to his lands, his plantation buildings, and his slaves, but their names are not given. They were treated simply as a kind of property. Slavery was never an uncontroversial institution in the early modern period, and this object helps us to connect with one of its most important early English critics. This is a halfpenny token, very similar to William Swift's, but issued instead in 1663 for two Kidderminster men, Edward Butler and Neville Simmons. If you look at the reverse on the right-hand side, you can see that Neville is named as a bookseller, but in fact this was only one part of his job. He was also a publisher, and worked with one of the most influential religious figures of the 17th century, the Kidderminster Puritan Richard Baxter. Baxter was probably the closest you can get to a Puritan rock star. He was prominent in just about every moral and religious debate of the age. In 1673, Neville Simmons, the token issuer, published a book by Baxter called The Christian Directory. In this book, Baxter plays the role of an agony aunt. He answers questions and gives advice on good conduct in everyday life. Now, some of the questions he answers relate to slavery. Clearly, it was already an uncomfortable topic, and some people had begun to seek the good Reverend's advice. While Baxter stopped short of condemning slavery as such, he was scathing about those English slave traders who prowled the West African coast. In his words, they were pirates engaged in one of the worst kinds of thievery in the world and should be condemned as the common enemies of mankind. Richard Baxter's moral critique of the slave trade anticipated a more powerful development 100 years later, the birth of the British abolitionist movement. From the 1780s onwards, men and women across Britain began to form campaign groups and organisations that sought to bring an end to the slave trade, and eventually the institution of slavery itself. Worcestershire was no exception, and by the early 19th century, abolitionists were organising in towns and villages across the county, everywhere from Evesham to Worcester, Broadway to Tenbury. Like Baxter, Many of these activists were driven by religious and moral conviction, and in Worcester the Quaker community played a particularly important role in the fight for abolition. Early campaigners included the Quaker Glovers Timothy Bevington and Stanley Pumphrey, and the Friends Meeting House on Sansom Walk played host to abolitionist meetings well into the 1830s. The abolitionist movement made use of all sorts of campaign techniques, from celebrity endorsements to consumer boycotts and mass petitions. But images were a powerful tool too, and no images in Britain were more widespread than those that featured on the coinage. As it happens, the appearance of the abolitionist movement coincided with a widespread shortage of small change, and canny activists seized the moment by commissioning tokens bearing anti-slavery messages. This is one of them, a copper alloy halfpenny token made at Birmingham in around 1795. On the obverse, on the left-hand side, is an image of a kneeling African, bound in chains and pleading with the reader, "Am I not a man and a brother?" This powerful image was designed by Josiah Wedgwood, the famous Midlands potter, and was the first example of a logo in widespread use for a political cause. The reverse, on the right-hand side, depicts a handshake, an image of fraternity, and the slogan, "May slavery and oppression cease throughout the world." By striking these tokens, the abolitionist messages literally gained a wide circulation, travelling in purses and pockets across the country. The abolitionist movement represented by this token was, however, only one part of a three-pronged assault on slavery in the British Atlantic. By the time the token had been struck, formerly enslaved Africans were living in Britain and giving testimony to the horrors of the slave system. In 1772, Ukasor Gronyasor, the man on the left, wrote an autobiography describing his capture by slavers and his transportation to the British colonies in Barbados and North America. This book is considered to be the first slave narrative published in England, and in fact it was written in Kidderminster, where he had settled out of respect for the legacy of Richard Baxter. The man on the right, Alorda Equiano, published his autobiography in 1789, describing his experience of slavery in the Americas. It was by far the most famous slave narrative of his time, and our own time too. We know that Equiano travelled throughout Worcestershire, where he gave public talks and sold his book with the support of local campaigners like Stanley Pumphrey. Testimonials from former slaves like Gronyasor and Equiano helped turn public opinion against slavery, but so too did the ongoing resistance of enslaved people on the plantations. In 1831 to 1832, around 60,000 Jamaican slaves rose up in the Baptist War, burning down the plantations and the crops in the field. They were brutally repressed by the Jamaican government, and the planter class launched reprisals on people they held responsible for the uprising, drawing revulsion in Britain. For their part, plantation owners and their families fought to defend slavery from its critics. Much like the abolitionists, they had powerful parliamentary supporters. This object is evidence of one significant electoral battle between pro- and anti-slavery MPs, the 1807 Yorkshire election, in which the famous abolitionist, William Wilberforce, went toe-to-toe with Henry Lascelles, the second Earl of Harewood and owner of slave plantations in Barbados and Jamaica. This is a medal struck to promote Lascelles' campaign, promoting him as a committed and independently minded politician on the matters of the day. Despite the vast sums of money that were spent in the campaign, the most expensive of any fought before 1832, the people of Yorkshire were not drawn to Lascelles' side, and Wilberforce was returned as their MP. In 1807, the same year that this medal was made, Wilberforce shepherded through Parliament an act abolishing the slave trade in the British Empire, and by 1833 the entire institution of slavery had been abolished with it. In doing so, however, Parliament made great concessions to slave owners like Lascelles. He personally received more than £26,000 from the British government, that's £2.5 million in modern money, in compensation for his lost property, the more than 12,000 slaves that he once owned. In fact, around £20 million was paid in compensation to British slave owners after 1837, equivalent to £2.4 billion in modern money. There was no such compensation for the freed slaves. I hope you found this video interesting, and thank you very much for watching.